again, as I said with Carrie, we'll do face-to-face stuff. That would be nice. Thanks a bunch. Is Katie on? Katie Fay? Let me see. Yes, she is.
I'm here.
Hi, great. What I'd like to do is just introduce Katie. She has her PhD from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, and she is a historical archaeologist with interest in 19th century American African diaspora. And one of the reasons I asked Katie to talk is her field of endeavor seems particularly appropriate in this time of questions about social justice and the treatment of people of color. Her topic is race relations in rural areas, examining the experiences of people of color on a 19th century frontier. Back to Katie's background, she has done postdoc work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, doing policy and planning and developing compliance with cultural and environmental preservation for new military bases overseas. And she is now, which is an interesting mix, an assistant manager of exhibitions, art collections and registration at the Denver Botanic Gardens. So this is a woman of many skills. And so it's with great pleasure that I'll turn the mic over to Katie. You're on.
Hello, everyone. As Linda said, I do have a seemingly rather eclectic background. Currently at the Botanic Gardens in my sort of background as a museum person. So let me see if I can share.
Chris, can you get your slide off?
There we go.
No, there you are. Okay, but you have the present now button, so you're good.
Okay, everybody see me now? See everything up?
Yes, you're good.
Great. So I was thinking as I was listening to everyone else's great talks that I feel a little bit like that Monty Python sketch where it's like, now for something completely different. So I feel a little bit like that, but it was really great for me to hear everybody else's talks and think about links actually to my own site, which might seem a little strange given the vast differences in time period and location, but lots of different methods and similar trends kind of pulling through each one. So I'm going to talk to you guys about some work that I did several years ago now, based my dissertation work at a site called New Philadelphia in Southern Illinois. So I'll start with talking about kind of the founding family for the town. The town kind of has its claim to fame, so to speak, is it was the first town legally founded and planned in advance, we need those qualifiers, by African Americans in the United States, as far as we know. There were certainly other towns founded before this one, but this one was the first legally founded town. So that's kind of its noteworthy, well, one of the many noteworthy things about this particular site. But I'll start with the family story. So the founding family for this town were called the McWorters. Frank and Lucy McWhorter here you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. On the top there's Lucy. She, like most of the McWhorter women, as their family likes to tell us all the time, are very, very long-lived. She lived to be about 90, was the family's best guess, and in the 1800s, that's very impressive. Frank depicted here on the bottom, he actually, we don't have photos of him. One of his fifth generation descendants, many of which work with us in this community project, actually is a sculptor. And so she was able to take photos of Frank and Lucy's sons, look at their facial features, look at the photos of Lucy, pull her facial features out, and then kind of extrapolate back to what Frank would have looked like, which is a level of artistic talent I can even imagine having. But it's fascinating and really impressive. And so that bust there is kind of our closest approximation to what Frank probably looked like at the time. But they were both born into slavery, lived in this later part of their life in Pulaski County, Kentucky. Frank, throughout his life, saved money by hiring his time and his labor out from his owner at the time. It's likely that the man who owned him was also his father. But he was able to do various labor projects, and he also operated a saltpeter mining business, which at this time, the War of 1812 was happening. So as you can imagine, mining one of the essential ingredients in gunpowder was a fairly lucrative business for him, and it was in high demand. So he made a decent amount of money. He was saving this money to purchase his freedom. But being a very intelligent man as he was, he purchased his wife Lucy's freedom first while she was pregnant in 1817. And if you know anything about kind of the freedom legal status at the time for African Americans, a child took on the free or enslaved status of the mother. So very smart move that he made to purchase her freedom first, so that the child she then had, which I believe was their 6th child at that time, would then also be free as well. He then saved up enough money once again to purchase his own freedom in 1819, Lucy helping him right along the way. Later then, they purchased a 160-acre parcel of land in southern Illinois in 1830, selling his farm that he was running and also his mining business and something of a trade, partial purchase for this sight unseen land. So he purchased this land from a man who had been granted it with the military bounty lands in Illinois. Again, if you were a veteran of the War of 1812, you were granted some land out west, as it was extremely the frontier at that time. So you can see this map here of the time there, and being having lived in Illinois for a while, this looks pretty familiar to me, but if not to you, you see the Mississippi River there on the left. The Illinois River is that other one kind of running diagonally through about the middle there. The bounty lands were in between those, pretty fertile croplands. The little red dot down there towards the bottom is the township that they bought the land in and then moved to in 1831. It took them about 6 months to get there from Kentucky. They had to take back roads, given sort of racial notions at the time and the dangers of being a free Black family traveling. So they took back roads, couldn't stay on major thoroughfares. And they also, of course, ended up traveling through the worst winter on record in the last several decades. So, of course, they did. But they finally made it. Began farming and engaging in a bunch of other enterprises, things like capturing runaway horses, returning them for bounties, killing wolves. We actually have a few wolf remains with cut marks where they were skinning them for the pelt to take them in to get the bounty for that. So lots of things that they were doing to raise money. And they were doing this to free other family members who remained enslaved throughout the East Coast, Kentucky, South Carolina, a few other places. So throughout their lives, the both of them and their children, as they were freed, they, and ending with provisions in Frank's will when he passed away, the McWorters freed 16 people in total, and it's several $100,000 in today's kind of currency exchange. So an incredible amount of money that they were able to, as a family, save up to go back at quite a high danger to themselves, to go back to these slaveholding states and areas to then purchase children, children's spouses, grandchildren, and I believe a few great-grandchildren towards the end. So very, very enterprising family. So another one of these endeavors to raise money was to found a town and then be able to sell blocks or lots instead of just larger agricultural chunks of land, would be able to make more money. So they founded a town in 1836. This is that part where I get that nice little legal qualification there. They hired a surveyor to lay out blocks and lots and filed this plat in the Pike County Courthouse. It's in Pike County in southern Illinois, and in Hadley Township. And this is the second version of the original plat map. This was in a larger, fancier put together plat book of the township. But this is the general plan for the town. About a 42-acre town site with multiple blocks and lots in there, fairly large for the time compared to other towns, streets and alleyways platted in as well. There are fairly vague census entries, which if you've ever had to look at census entries, it's for a lot of reasons can be rather difficult, not just for the fact that reading historic cursive is like trying to read a different language that you may or may not speak, but also they tended to not list, especially in rural areas, specifically who lived in a town or not. So our best guess is possibly up to about 100 people lived in this town at the height of its population in about the mid-1800s. So that's our best guess, probably also including people from the surrounding agricultural area that would have potentially come into town for various needs. So we had both homeowners and renters in there on various census documents and other things like property tax records and all kinds of title deeds and things. We have renters listed fairly frequently, usually moving through the area. So both homeowners, renters, merchants, several different types of stores kind of would come and go, various types of tradespeople, blacksmiths, cobbler, wheelwrights, cabinet makers. There was a post office there for a while, making it an actual official town, which during this time around the 1830s, there was a small town kind of founding boom, but not many of them actually survived or even came off paper. So this one was one of them and even had a post office to prove it. But given that the town and community residents were primarily agrarian based on census records, but also kind of this general news articles we were able to find, most everyone is farming in some capacity. So several people owned lots and property in town and outside of town. So this is another plat map of the area at the time, kind of looking at land ownership. And if you look at some of these names, if you're able to read them, you might notice a few McWhorter names. So they actually owned at one point, obviously most of town, and then large parcels of land outside of town. And if you can see, you may notice that there are quite a few female names listed on there as well, Sarah and Louisa, there in particular. We'll get back to them in a moment. But also there was quite a known history of Black women owning land in this immediate area, which is fairly rare at the time. So and a lot of these other names too, Shipmans, Burdicks, Hadsells, they also own land in and outside of town. And also are some of the families, to include the McWhorters, but also these other ones that have been with us throughout this whole community engaged project. Both descendant families and local community have been very, very involved in the project. We've been very lucky. So one theory of the town's eventual decline, about the 1880s, there was basically nothing left there except for a few houses still standing. One cites the bypass of the railroad in 1869, which you can see kind of running diagonal through that map here. You can see my mouse arrow there. It didn't actually run through town, and there were initially quite a few theories about the fact that this may have been racially motivated based on the owners of the railroad pulling it through that part of Illinois. And we had all kinds of different people looking at topo maps and other things, try to figure out why they chose the route they did. We basically came down to, we don't really know for sure. There's no concrete, document saying this is why we're doing this. It does follow a pretty good topographic path. But there's another theory about why the town actually didn't maybe want the railroad coming through. There actually is very, very strong McWhorter family oral history that they were participating in the Underground Railroad through New Philadelphia. So if you remember back on that military bounty land map, this town is about 15 miles, I think, from the Missouri border, from the Mississippi River and from Missouri, which was a slave state at the time. Hannibal, Missouri is the closest city, which if you're a Mark Twain fan, maybe you've been there, heard of it. That's what they're sort of known for there. But at this time, it was an active slave market. There were pretty constantly different sales going on, lots of newspaper articles about different auctions that were happening. So there would have been a decent amount of sort of escaping enslaved folk traffic coming through here and escaping. And there is a very much beloved oral history story from the McWhorters that everyone knew that if they escaped in some of these caves that were along the creek bed, you can kind of see on the right-hand side of that map here, that they would hide them in the caves, and that the cobbler in town, who was also African-American, would make shoes for everyone escaping. So if you got to New Philadelphia, you'd get some shoes to help you in your journey the rest of the way. This is one of those things too for archaeologists that's very difficult to prove concretely. Underground Railroad by its very nature was secret and used essentially sort of hidden in plain sight kind of mentality, objects and places for this. So that's very difficult to nail down this to be supported by actual archaeological evidence or not. But we have no reason to doubt this story from the family. Seems like it would make sense. So we kind of are now leaning towards an idea that they actually would not have fought to have the actual railroad come through New Philadelphia because they didn't want to have more attention on themselves, potentially to know what they were doing, which obviously was illegal to participate in this activity at the time. We also also not really thinking much towards the racial motivations in terms of the bypass. We don't have any evidence of physical segregation by race in town. People were buying lots and blocks next to each other. There was no sort of, this is the white section, this is the black section, none of that in town. And we also don't have any evidence of racially motivated violence within the town limits. There's no newspaper articles or letters or any kind of family communication or photos discussing that this ever happened here. And we have a reasonably good belief that we would have had it happen, because there are several newspaper articles and, again, other family letters that were shared with us discussing the fact that the KKK was fairly active in a few townships near there. And several people had, in fact, fallen victim to racial violence or cross burnings, things like that. But there is no record of this happening in New Philadelphia, which in itself is, again, quite an interesting point for the time period. So kind of moving forward a little bit in time, then we'll jog back to history a little bit. This is the site relatively recently. It's probably about 10 or 15 years ago now, this aerial photo. But this is the site. It's a 42-acre town site outlined in yellow here. That road that runs along the north edge of town here, this is called the Bayless Blacktop. It's the same road that was there in the 1800s, but linking small farm communities. This road that runs through the center of town here does mirror that kind of, if you remember just from that map, you had the main roads crisscrossing through town. It does actually sit on the old roadbed, which was nice for us. And then we had actually one of the local landowners, I believe there's 3 or 4 families who own parcels of this land and have held it in land trust for several years, which was great. But he came through and mowed some of the grass before this photo was taken. And these are actually mowed into the actual plotted sizes of the blocks and lots that would have been sold. So you can kind of get a better idea of the layout of the town this way. And we can also see some modern ponds were dug in and some agricultural terracing put in. So we had a little bit of worry coming at the very beginning of this project that due to farming immediately after the town kind of faded out and went away, people moved, both with that and this terracing and digging of the ponds, there may not be much left in the way of archaeology. Pretty frequently for historic archaeology, since we're relatively shallow, and also obviously also in various prehistoric sites as well, but we all kind of probably know that the plow can be awfully damaging to sites, so we were a little worried about it. I'll get back to how thankfully that was not a problem for us. But Louisa McWorter is actually the focus of this particular flavor of that much, much larger New Philadelphia archaeology project. We've got lots and lots of, different fingers in the pot, so to speak, different projects, different folks doing different types of analysis. But this one was mine that I focused on for my dissertation. So this is Louisa here on the right. We are fairly positive she pronounced her name Louisa and not Louisa. She's also sometimes listed in the census as Eliza, which gave us our first clue, and then several family descendants and other folks who were participating in the project said, oh yeah, they know tons of people who spell it this way, but pronounce it Louisa. So we're fairly sure that that is the correct pronunciation. So another fun kind of past-present linkage there. She also, Louisa Clark McWorter, she was also born into slavery. She was freed as a child along with her mother. Purchased, we think, by the man who was her father, and then summarily left where they were living. I think it was South Carolina, I want to say. They left there and came, all 3 of them together as a family unit, to Illinois. So it is likely that we think her parents were in a relationship together and came here. He left his white family back and left them and came out here with Louisa's mother. They lived together until they both passed away, or he passed away. And then Louisa actually took in her mother into her own household and cared for her in her old age. The New Philadelphia story has lots of very interesting sort of family dynamics like that. It's very fascinating. If you ever want to get lost in sort of historical soap opera drama, there's a lot of it here. So Louisa married one of Frank and Lucy's sons, Squire, in 1843. By 1853, we know for sure, possibly earlier, but census records, we know for sure by 1853 they were living within New Philadelphia based on tax deeds or tax rolls and land deeds in the census. So Squire actually died in 1855, leaving her a widow, the head of her household, a landowner. She owned approximately 120 acres at the height of her landowning career, and the possible manager of the farm on all of those acres. She and her children were running the farm. We think probably also cooperatively farming with the other McWhorter family members living in the area. They all have probates, which is, again, rather notable and unusual. But each one of them has sort of groups of different farm equipment, so they don't all just have a smattering that you need to do everything. Like one person had all the threshing equipment, and one person had a whole bunch of plow equipment. So it was kind of a strange way, but we think that they were probably cooperatively farming together. So she's probably having a say in that as well. She also at one point owned almost all of the blocks in New Philadelphia and was it may have been running kind of the overall sale and management of the land within the town itself too. For most of her life, she lived, after she moved there, lived within New Philadelphia in that same house on the same block. Was probably the largest home in the town based on tax rolls and the really excellent oral history we have from a gentleman who remembers the house still standing when he was a child in the 20s and early 1930s. But she lived there most of her life except for a couple-year period where all of a sudden the family disappears and the tax assessment on that lot just drops to almost nothing. And they reappear in Quincy, Illinois, which is several miles down the road on the river, and then come back after that couple-year period. So it was one of the questions we kind of had coming into this excavation was, what happened there? Why did that happen? We'll get to that why that happened in a moment. So moving into excavations at this home site. So this is a walkover survey map from 2002. The New Philadelphia Archaeology Project was actually instigated by local community members and family descendants of McWorters and other families who were interested in having excavations done here. And they contacted some archaeologists and asked to come out. And so several different universities, along with the Illinois State Museum, got together, started the project. We started with a walkover survey, and you can see kind of briefly highlighted here in these sections. I keep waving like I'm going to touch the screen like I normally do in a lecture or a talk, but you can see these outlines here. These are the areas that were actually walked. This area gets very boggy. It's kind of at the bottom of a hill, and there's a few buildings here. So this is the area that we walked, and we piece plotted with transit every time we found an artifact. And you can see there are some very obvious groupings here in the center of town. And this one in particular reads directly on Louisa's house. So this is her home site here, and sort of the base of operations for all of these excavations that I'll talk about. And we were slightly more heartened by this in saying, okay, well, there's still something here, and the plow hasn't completely destroyed all of it over the years. But Louisa herself passed away in 1883. Her daughter, Lucy, and her husband purchased the house from Louisa's estate. It then passed to her brothers after Lucy passed away, and it remained in the McWhorter family until about the turn of the century, when another local family, the Burdicks, you might remember them from that previous map, bought the home and rented it out. So there were renters in it in 1937 when it caught fire and burned down. We have newspaper articles detailing the fact that the man was heating his can of engine oil on the wood stove in the house on a particularly cold morning. I believe it was in February. And it started sparking and then spilled and caught the house on fire. Thankfully, the family was fine. They were able to escape, but we found several articles detailing sort of church drives to help them get clothing and other items they needed, but they were all okay. But the house itself was considered a loss. It was torn down the rest of the way and never rebuilt. But we did, as I said, found all of these artifacts here in that walkover survey in 2002. So moving then into more excavations, more actual digging holes in the ground excavations. In 2005, we did initial kind of ground truthing, just a few units here and there to see if there was anything left. Thankfully, there was. So in 2010, we came back and did a kind of a plan exposure of the house site itself. On the plan map on the left here, you can see the ones that are kind of shaded in white match this photo layout here. And the ones that are clear here match this, which is the area that was then dug in the next field season. I'll show a photo in just a moment, was the trench. We then dug through it to see the depth of the house foundation. So you can sort of see, hopefully, might be able to see the soil change here. Culturally sterile soil in Illinois, you hit fairly quickly this kind of yellowy, loamy clay soil. That's our culturally sterile layer, and you can kind of see that change here from that real dark organic. And you have some of this wall fall here. And it kind of curves up right about where the shadow line is, of course. Where you can see we have some chimney debris here, and then up along this line again, wall fall, and back down this side. So it was roughly a 20 by 20 cellar feature, which is impressively large for the time, but matches this idea that we had that it was a fairly large house. So in 2011, we then came back to that site, and now we've kind of swapped angles here for this photo on the right. So now we are facing west instead of north. But this is the trench we ended up digging through in the area that was outlined previously. You can see that nice yellowy sterile soil there at the bottom. But we ended up going about 4.5 feet down before we hit that sterile, which is, again, a very deep cellar feature. Typically, in this area of the world, you're used to cellar storage pits, not a full walk-in cellar, which we found out this was. Also, if you're wondering, most historic archaeologists, at least that I know, typically will excavate in feet and inches, which is rather different than our friends in prehistoric land, I know. But we usually typically prefer to do that as things we are excavating were often built using feet and inches, so we choose to then excavate them in feet and inches to match that same standard. If you're ever reading a report later and get confused on it. So you can also see lots and lots of things sticking out of the walls here. There were very, very many artifacts to the point where it actually slowed us down quite a bit in terms of excavating through this much. This is not even half of the feature. We kept to National Park Service standards on excavating half or less each feature with that. Excuse me. This picture here on the left is something else we found rather interesting, about 6 inches from this culturally sterile bottom here. We found a pretty thick ash layer. It was just ash. It was kind of this interesting thing to come down on. All of a sudden, your trowel just scoots right through ash instead of the sort of very loamy soil we had been digging through with all the organic matter in it. And we found it was several inches of ash, charcoal bits, burned artifacts, burned pieces of slate and wood and nails, a couple sizable, essentially floor timber chunks. And we thought, oh, well, based on the age of the artifacts that then came out of that same layer, well, we're pretty sure that's what happened to the house. That time when Louisa and her family just disappeared from the town, and their house also disappeared from those tax rolls, and then came back a couple years later. So the house likely burned down. Again, given that there's no discussion about it being potentially arson, probably an accident or a potential lightning strike, it is up on a hill. Definitely possible. That part of Illinois gets some pretty rolling good thunderstorms that during this time of year. Actually, in fact, we had to shelter a few times from hail, which is great in the field. But we were fairly certain that it was an accidental fire burned the house down, and here was the evidence that we had been searching for about what happened to them for those few years. And they did come back, rebuild, and then it was the 1937, or the second house that burned down in 1937 again. So bad luck with fire there, I guess. So in terms of analysis, the artifacts, we found just in those couple years of excavations in that trench, over 20,000 artifacts just from that cellar feature. That's not counting few units that were posted around outbuildings, likely barn or sheds, and also the well, a couple feet and probably about 20, 30 feet from the house. That was also not counted in this number. So 20,000 artifacts in that less than half of the cellar feature excavated, which was a logistical challenge to get through all of them in terms of analysis and cataloging. This collection now lives at the Illinois State Museum. So to get it ready to go into their collections was a bit of a chore, but thankfully our NSF REU field school that happened for 6 years, we had 6 seasons of that, did in fact include lab time. So we were able to have our NSF students help us with that. Comparison of artifacts to other households in town actually revealed relatively similar assemblages with only a few differences. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment in terms of what that actually means. But that is not what we were expecting, to find assemblages that were similar between Louisa's family, some of the other families in town, to include white families. We were expecting to see differences. Other projects within the same time frame in other areas had found notable differences in material culture analysis, and we were expecting that we would find a similar thing, and actually did not. So as I believe someone previously mentioned, when you get thrown a curveball, especially in your dissertation, you have some panic moments, but we figured it out, so it was good. Here's a few photos of artifacts that were found. Surprising number of relatively intact bottles, but owing that to the depth of that feature, they were well outside the range of that plow. One from a local druggist. This one here is from the local town just down the road. So that's always a fun thing to find. Lots and lots and lots of ball mason jars, which is here, and then these are the liner lids here on the bottom, which if you've ever excavated in this time period, they most of them say genuine porcelain, and they are not. They're milk glass. So that's one of those fun things where your science kind of lies to you. So you have to be able to identify that sort of thing. So we've encountered things like that a couple times where historical advertising does not in fact match reality, which hopefully surprises not that many people. But we found a very, very high percentage of both ball mason jars for storing food, and also utilitarian stonewares for cooking, and also for salting things like meats, pork, but also to sort of, as my great grandmother will always say, to put up food, to store it for later, put into that huge cellar to feed the family through the winter. So a very high percentage of that in Louisa's, especially, as opposed to other families. So we have a theory that she may have been one of her sort of cooperative farming tasks with the family, may have in fact been to be the one who is storing a lot of food for everybody and doing that actual labor. They were also tapped into national and international markets. You can see here on the bottom left, these are coming from overseas. So they're coming from England, lots of different ceramic locations they're coming from. A few from local, mostly the stonewares are coming from a local, which is not surprising. They're much heavier and harder to ship and not get damaged. But they were definitely tapped into both local, national, and international markets, and had the ability to get, to a certain extent, almost anything they might have needed at that time. A few of the more sort of personal objects that were definitely fun to find, and favorites of people who were there helping us, our volunteers, to dig, both local residents and descendant family members. So this here on the top is pocket watch, the remains of anyway. One of the McWhorter siblings we think may have been a watchmaker or collector at least. His probate had, I believe, over a dozen watches, which is an astronomical amount for that time. So that was a fun find for the McWhorter family, especially. Top right here, this says President. This is a suspender clip buckle. Typically, this company also only made suspenders for women and for children, so they were smaller, which accounts for its rather small size. So we have definite indicator of children growing up here. Also the ever-present and always very creepy porcelain doll heads when you're excavating, and there's just all of a sudden a small little face staring out at you. So there were also several of those. Down here on the bottom right is a trivet for cooking in the fire. You can't quite see it in this photo, but this handle here is actually in a heart shape. And again, the McWhorter family liked to think that it was probably made for Louisa by her sons, which were both the blacksmiths in town. Maybe they have made this, and it certainly is a hand-wrought piece. So there's kind of this fun thought story about it, that it would have been made by her sons for her. And then on the bottom left here is probably one of the most favorite objects, both of us on the team, but also the McWhorter family. This is a uniform button from the Civil War, from a Union soldier. Three of Louisa's family members, her brother and both those two sons who were blacksmiths, went to serve in the war. They actually left New Philadelphia and went to Michigan to join the colored troops units out of one of the colored troops units out of Michigan and served. They all came home, but they did serve in the Army and came home with this. And this was such a tangible link to that moment of their family history that it was a very, very exciting find, especially for the family, but for us as well. We had found 3 in total. Another favorite find of mine was a pair of eyeglasses. I couldn't find the photo, but a pair of eyeglasses with the lenses still in. And there's some photos of a few McWhorters with eyeglasses. So that was a fun trying to match who maybe had worn these. So what does all this mean? We found all this stuff, dug all these years on this one particular home site. So kind of what does it mean? In general, when we're comparing assemblages, to think about what it says, obviously, about the people who are using these objects. Commonalities between assemblages from different households typically means similarity in community mindset. The goals kind of everyone. Similarity in access to material goods. We kind of knew, again, they all generally had the same type of access to different stores, catalogs, that sort of thing. And also similar material usage patterns. So they're using the items they're purchasing in a similar way. Again, and that community mindset does make a good amount of sense when you're thinking about New Philadelphia in terms of most of them are agrarian families, living a relatively similar lifestyle at that time. Typically, differences between these types of assemblages can suggest variations in effects and experiences of societal norms and legal restrictions. Specifically, thinking about New Philadelphia, Illinois was a free state at the time, but that did not mean that people of color living in Illinois would have had exactly the same life experience as the white people that live there. They absolutely would not have. They were not considered to be, legally speaking, people or citizens of that area. At that time, Frank McWhorter himself actually had to petition the state legislature of Illinois to be recognized as a legal person who would be able then to do things like sue and be sued, to do things like file that plat in the county courthouse, to purchase land, sign his name to documents, all this sort of thing. And he was granted that. So yet another sort of first in Illinois that sadly was not talked about much before this project started, and we're worming our way into classroom protocols now, but we're working on it. But that obviously would have an effect on how you live if you are not really considered the same level of person as your neighbor is, just because you're Black. We also expect variations based on other aspects of individuals, not just sort of their social status or your racial identity, but also things like religion. Your dietary patterns can be affected by this. Louisa was known to be a rather staunch Baptist. And there's also family stories and people referring to her in some letters and other writings that a lot of the McWhorters were very against drinking. And so that actually reflected itself in her assemblage. There's not a lot of liquor bottles, either spirits or beer, as compared to some of the other households. So very, very small differences, but we think we have found out why that might be. Also age, of course, the presence of children, they leave different things, materially speaking, and also people who are older, especially when you're talking the historic period and you have things like patent medicines that are specifically prescribed for people who are older or people who have different maladies such as arthritis that tend to affect people as they get up there in age. So you sometimes can kind of figure out some things about folks that way. We also have things like variations in personal preferences. Of course, maybe people just don't like the color blue, so they don't buy the same plates as their neighbor because of that. So a lot of these things kind of are all tumbling around in our minds as we're doing all this analysis to kind of try to think about, where does that leave us, right? What does it tell us about this? So I chose to kind of look at this from the perspective of, for me, the biggest unexpected thing was that this pattern of similar assemblages between both Black and white families did not match the very stark differences that are seen in those similar assemblages for similar folks at that time in large urban areas. And I was thinking about why might that be. One of the most well-known studies talking about this issue is by Dr. Paul Mullins, and he was working in Annapolis at the time and noted that African-American families tended to most often buy brand name products, and extrapolated out that is likely due to racism, inherent biases by store owners, that they would try to inflate prices, but on name branded items, you couldn't do that. They have to be sold at a certain price, whereas the sort of locally made products, they could raise and lower prices depending on who the customer was at their leisure. We didn't see things like that in New Philadelphia at all. So this does suggest that there's something different, obviously, between urban and rural areas. And it points to different experiences and stresses in those different environments. There's generally that sort of stereotype pretty much everywhere in this country that rural areas can, and sometimes are, not always, be more racist than urban areas. Whether that's true or not, it definitely isn't everywhere, but that is kind of a generally held societal stereotype that we have here. And it is not always true. And we also have to remember, looking back and kind of comparing modern experiences to the past, they're not going to be the same. And that we tend to think, and I believe someone else already mentioned this in their talk too, we tend to think, oh, because people do that this way today, that's probably how they did it then. Not always the case. But in a rural area, in a rural community, especially where the land you are buying your land from an African-American family, one would imagine that you knew that moving to this area, and we are assuming that they would not have had that sort of racialized inclination to be, sort of deliberately thwarting or deliberately preying upon these people of color in this area if they knew that they were moving here. And so that created a different type of environment right around this New Philadelphia area. However, they would have encountered inequality and racism whether they lived in an urban or rural environment, especially at that time, as I just mentioned, not actually being legal people yet. But it was likely experienced in a much different way, depending on the particulars of where they lived, what their particular profession was, who their neighbors were, their social situation, their economic status. Religion could play a part in this. There's so many different factors at play here that we really have to be careful to avoid that trap of assuming that what is happening in one area in history is happening. We just kind of have this blanket assumption that that's how it is everywhere else. And I was quite surprised to find kind of a lack of discussion about this urban-rural difference at that time through this particular area of African diaspora archaeology. But it was an interesting thing to kind of explore and shine some light on this difference that we were able to find. So kind of very, very pulling out, once again, bigger picture that the community seemed to exist in relative peace and without any very violent racially motivated incidents, unlike a lot of their neighbors, states and communities included. But that obviously doesn't mean that every resident had that exact same experience. This is not to say that it was some kind of racialized utopia of the time, certainly not, but they definitely were doing better in terms of racial violence than other places at this time. Most people living in New Philadelphia were living in that economic class just above subsistence farming. And that kind of engenders this kind of helping your neighbor mentality. Being from a rural farming community, as I am, you kind of grow up in that mental experience. That is something that I do think probably would have also extended back to this point in time. But as archaeologists, we can't assume that a person in a city at a point in time in the past is having the same experience as a person in a rural area, or sort of looking at it again, kind of broad perspective, that similar assemblages means similar people were using them. If we had no idea who was living here, we may have thought that everyone was demographically similar because all of their material culture is very similar. And this is kind of a nice reminder lesson of, hey, that's actually not always the case. So we have to be careful to not assume that when excavating at a site that we actually don't know for certain who was living where. So kind of in my wrapping up here, the future of the New Philadelphia site, if you're ever in Southern Illinois and feel like going to take a look at it, you can go visit it. The site now has a bunch of signage discussing the history of the town, our project, what's going on there. There's a walking trail now with signposts. And there's also a downloadable smartphone app that kind of projects, using your camera feature, 3D renderings of buildings onto the landscape. So you kind of hold your phone and turn, and you'll sort of see through your camera these buildings as they would have looked like on the site. This is the rendering of Louisa's house. I worked with our graphic designer on this to make sure that it's as close as we can get it based on what we excavated. Slate shingles, brick chimney, fieldstone stacked foundation, lots of window glass, which is like the bane of historic archaeological existence when you're excavating. Probably wood clad sides, and likely 2 stories. This also goes with that oral history of the gentleman who was a child in that area in the 20s and 30s, and he did remember this being a large 2-story house. Also, and very excitingly, we found out just last week that it is currently a national landmark, but it is now finally, after many years of a process, under consideration to become a unit of the National Park Service. So the bill was introduced by Representative Devin LaHood from Illinois into the House this month. So it is currently undergoing that process. If anyone is really interested in helping us in that endeavor, I can forward you the letter to send to your representative to encourage support for this to become an official unit of the Park Service. And we've harbored this hope all along, which is why we adhere to their excavation standards while doing the project, because we were hoping this whole time since 2002 that maybe eventually it could become part of the Park Service. Also, if you are in Illinois, you can go to the State Museum. Some of our artifacts that have been excavated, they're on display. Also, a few at the Springfield and Central Illinois African American History Museum. Both of those institutions are in Springfield, Illinois, the capital. And we are also very honored to have some of our excavated objects in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC. And this was fairly recent, they opened fairly recently, but some of our objects are there. There is a case devoted to the McWhorter family and the story of New Philadelphia. So if you're in DC, you can go check that out as well. And potentially, maybe possibility of more research in the future, but we're not quite sure on that yet, as especially now, given everything is crazy. But a lot of us have kind of scattered everywhere across the country. So we may or may not get back to there sometime soon, but hopefully in the future, we'll have more ongoing research happening there. If you want to read more about this specific project, this is an article that was the distillation of dissertation, which no one really probably wants to read a 300-page book on this. If you do, I can send it to you. I'm happy to share it. But this is a much shorter version in the Journal of African Diaspora Archaeology and Heritage, if you have access to it. If you'd like it and can't access it, please send me an email. I'm happy to get that for you if you're really interested in reading it. Or in general, the New Philadelphia Town Site or all of our research, we've been open source, open access to our research this whole project. So we have all of our excavation data, all of our notes, maps, artifact databases, historic research, everything is all on our website. You can go check it out if you'd like. The New Philadelphia Archaeology Project, it's hosted through the University of Illinois. The New Philadelphia Association also has its own website. It's the nonprofit that's sort of been championing this cause. And there's fundraising efforts constantly ongoing to try to purchase and protect the remaining pieces of the town site. They are held in a land trust, but we would like to buy them from all the separate families who own them to keep them together and safe for future research. We also have a unit within the National Park Service Teaching with Historic Places program. So if you're a teacher or know someone who is, the Park Service has a lot of these lessons they've kind of put together for various age levels in classrooms to teach these different stories of these historic places throughout the country. And we have one. So if you'd like to, you can also check that out. And I believe that is all. So I will stop sharing and take questions.
Okay, I don't see any questions per se, but I see a lot of positive comments. That's good.
Oh, good.
Just as an interesting side note, I spent from the late 60s through the 70s, I spent time living in Southern Illinois and never knew about this. But my comment is, when you were talking about the racial relationships among the people, is in the late 60s, my older daughter started school in Carbondale, Illinois, which is a little farther south. That was literally the first year the schools in that town desegregated.
Yeah.
And it was, having moved from the Northeast, it was truly culture shock.
Yes. Yeah. This particular area, it's, I guess we could say affectionately referred to as Forgotonia in this area of Illinois. So fun trivia fact, if you ever need, if that ever comes up in bar trivia or something, because it did not have a highway running through it until the mid 1990s. So there was no state or interstate highway running through there until the 1990s, which is when the initial push for, hey, let's save New Philadelphia started, because they were going to run the highway directly through the town site, and the local community was able to fight back enough and say, no, we know what's here, we want to save it and protect it. That's when that nonprofit group got together with some of the family descendants and said, no, you can't blow out this really important site, and we're so glad they did.
Wow, that is impressive. There's a comment from Samantha Liberty about notes for future teachings. Is there, do you want to hand out your email address or something?
Sure, yeah, I can.
Okay.
I'll just put it in the chat here.
Okay.
The non-work ones, since I have about 3 different work emails. So
and
there's my email. Feel free to send me a note if you want any other information. There's also, I saw Becca's comment about educational products coming out of, considering additional educational products coming out of the project, thinking this could be a great rural comparison to the Davis Bottom project Archaeology Shotgun House. That is awesome. I'm going to write that down.
Also, I think Amber has a question for you as well.
So to briefly answer that question, Becca, well, in my dissertation, I did do some comparative work in my master's thesis as well, compared this site to other entirely Black towns and communities, and also integrated towns and communities, and did a little bit of that. I was rather dismayed at the lack of availability of rural town site excavation data. I'm sure it has been done, but it's likely locked up in that sort of CRM gray zone, some of it anyway. And I would like to explore that further in the future to do more comparisons and get potentially more discussion about to kind of fill that gap of rural versus urban in this African diasporic field, which would be really great. Amber asked if I was able to get any general information about town dynamics from the interview with the gentleman that remembered seeing the house, and perhaps through oral tradition. Yes, we were. There was an oral history project that also went along with, so lots of fingers in this pot, lots of different projects. We did have an oral history project that interviewed any descendant family member that would sit down with us from any of the families who at any point lived in New Philadelphia. Not just the McWhorters, also anybody local, including that one particular gentleman who actually drew us a memory map of what he remembered of still extant structures still on the site, which was very helpful. He called Louisa's house the hotel, which there was kind of this old, I guess, notion that it was a hotel because it was so big. It was definitely not a hotel, but it does go to the idea that it was much bigger than the other houses there at the time. But we did have a lot of, both from the oral history and from correspondence from people who lived in that area that were, again, willing to share their family letters with us, discussion about the fact that it was really not, there were not a lot of racial issues at the time. People who lived there seemed to be, as far as we're able to find, seemed to be okay with living in an integrated town before the Civil War, which, as you probably all well know, didn't happen very much. And most people who lived there seemed to understand they were moving there. The McWhorter family and several other then African-American families who then moved there after were well established there. Frank himself represented his local Baptist church as a deacon at I can't remember, it was a regional meeting. So he went as that church's racially integrated church's representative to a larger meeting for this Baptist church, seemingly with, again, no problem. This was accepted. So it's a very interesting and different dynamic than we see at a lot of other places at this time. And the story is kind of sneaking into, as I kind of briefly mentioned, sneaking into curriculum elsewhere. There is a couple of Illinois history textbooks that have come out in the last 10 to 15 years that now include this story. And it is now, I think, now actually officially in the Illinois State history teaching curriculum, that it is one of the things that you can discuss when teaching Illinois history in primary schools. So we're getting there. We're getting there.